First part of the Western farmers, we're going to talk about the Native Americans. We'll talk about the mineral rushes. We'll talk about the cattle drives. And then next time, we'll actually talk about the farmers. So we're going to talk about the first couple. So here we go. All right. So really, the story of the Gilded Age in terms of the 1860s to 1900 is a story about really putting a squeeze on the Native Americans. So you have people east of the Mississippi River, and then you have, as of the late 1840s, 1850s, and now pressing on to the 60s, you have a significant amount of American settlement due to the mineral rushes in California on the West Coast. And so now in the Gilded Age, you have settlers coming in, farmers coming in, more mineral rushes, the cattle drives, and so all these groups are putting pressure on the Native Americans that are there. And so we need to understand that the group that is west of the Mississippi River during the Gilded Age starts out in the 1860s, somewhere around 250,000 people. And there's a great diversity among the tribes. Probably the most popular of the groups, or the group that we know the most about, typically are the Plains Indians. So, the Blackfeet, the Sioux. These are the groups that followed the great buffalo herds, and they really depended on the buffalo for everything. They made their teepees out of them. They made their clothing out of them. Their bows out of the sinews, the tendons. They even used their poop for fuel. And so we're talking about a couple of million, wild buffalo roaming the plains before Americans get there. And, it wasn't just the Americans that helped to decimate the herds. It certainly didn't help. The Native Americans did it too, to some degree, but really as buffalo hides become fashionable in the East and in Europe, Americans are going to come out by way of the railroad. Hunting groups are going to come out, and they're really going to decimate the herds to the point where they are almost extinct. So that was really impactful on the Native Americans. Now, the railroads are going to be huge in terms of bringing settlers out, bringing people out, bringing manufactured goods out that are going to impact the Native Americans, that are going to change their way of lives. Everything from guns, the way we live. There's going to be a lot of pressure on Native Americans to adopt Americans' way of living. But the real major impact of the railroads is just going to bring the people out, whether it's cowboys, miners, farmers. And, those people are going to really negatively impact the Native Americans. Okay, a couple other groups that you should probably know about in the Southwest. Of course, we have the Pueblos, kind of the mountain dwellers there, the people that, they're farmers. They created these massive irrigation projects. They had to because it was so dry. And then in the Great Northwest, up in Idaho, you have the Nez Perce, in the areas up near Oregon and Washington. You have groups like the Walla Walla, Spokane, groups like that. Now, from the 1860s to the 1880s, there were a series of conflicts between Native Americans and citizens of the United States, and these conflicts are kind of collectively called the Indian Wars. So there's no actual Indian War. It's just a series of kind of random confrontations as Americans come in, and kind of from the big picture standpoint is that you're going to have these mineral rushes. You're going to have things like the Homestead Acts. And as Americans come into this area, they really put a demand on the U.S. government, and the U.S. government's very willing to use the U.S. Army to protect, the mineral loads that were coming out of California, Nevada, and the Dakotas, Colorado even. But, the U.S. Army is going to protect the farmers that are taking advantage of the Homestead Act. The government knows that the more people that settle in the West, the more resources that are going to be found, the more solid of a claim that the United States government has to this land, and so they really back whether it's the farmers, the miners, the cattlemen through this 1860s to 1880s, even up to 1890 period, and it's really detrimental to the Indians, to the Native Americans. Okay, so one of the first conflicts that you need to know is the Sand Creek Massacre in 1864. That's a really sad story. Let me put up the map here. So Sand Creek is right here in Colorado. It's kind of on our eastern plains. There was a Colonel John Shivington, and he had invited Native American leaders to come to this area and to talk, truce. And then when these Native American leaders came there, then he had his militia just massacre these people, and not just massacre them, but massacre the women and the children with them. So this is a really, really ugly episode, and something that you've probably never heard about in our state's history, but something that really was an awful thing that people from the United States did, and from our state did. Probably the most famous of the Indian Wars that people know about is the Battle of Little Bighorn. George Custer, who is actually he fought in the Civil War. He was a Union soldier, fought at Gettysburg. He was, out in the West. Rumors of gold were floating around in the Dakotas areas, and he was actually traveling, trying to get a group of Native Americans back onto what was supposed to be their reservation. And he came upon an encampment of them, and instead of kind of waiting for help, kind of got around them, and they found out about the 200 U.S. cavalrymen. And this group of Native Americans, about 2,000 of them, encircled Custer and his men, and all of them ended up dying. So whereas Sand Creek, the massacre was the Native Americans, and Battle of Little Bighorn, it was Custer and all of his men died. And this, if you've ever been, the Battle of Little Bighorn is, right outside of Wyoming. If you're going north on I-25, right as you get into kind of southeastern Montana. Okay, next of the Indian Wars, so to speak, is this chase of Chief Joseph and the Nez Perce. And as you can see on the map there in the bottom right-hand corner, it's about a 1,500-mile chase. The U.S. Army was chasing this group, trying to capture them. They end up sending most of them to a reservation in Oklahoma. But what's remarkable about this is that Chief Joseph was able to elude the U.S. Army for months, where they're packing along 1,500 people, including many women and children and old people. And they traveled 1,500 miles. I mean, that's an incredible. That's like traveling from Denver to Los Angeles. And they did it mostly on foot. I mean, some people did have horses, but a lot of people traveled on foot. Finally, the U.S. Army, they were just like almost to Canada. If they would have gotten to Canada, the U.S. Army wouldn't have had any jurisdiction. They'd had to let them go. And, just right up within about 50 miles before the Canadian border, the U.S. Army caught Chief Joseph, and kind of his famous quote, he said, I will fight no more forever. And so that was a defeat of the natives there. All right, on to kind of the ghost dance in Wounded Knee. So this is really seen as probably the last major stand by Native Americans. And there was a Native American in Nevada who had a vision. And that vision was that there was a Messiah that was going to be coming. And so, the vision instructed the Native Americans to have this festival, kind of this dancing, look a little bit, crazy, but just this festival dance each time there was a new moon. And so these, what were called ghost dances, they started kind of spreading throughout the West, and it started unnerving some of the white settlers. And it kind of came to a head in Wounded Knee, South Dakota in 1890. Where the natives were kind of in the middle of their ghost dance, and a bunch of white settlers in the U.S. Army surrounded them and killed them. That was really the last main resistance of the Native Americans, was the ghost dance at Wounded Knee. There was one other kind of isolated resistance. Now, this was a little bit before Wounded Knee in the 1880s. Geronimo, he was an Apache, and really he had just given the U.S. Army and settlers in the West fits throughout the 1870s and 80s. And finally, in the late 1880s, they ended up catching him and putting him on a reservation as well. And so that ends kind of the famous Indian Wars of the 1860s to 1880s. All right, some things that, besides the wars that affected the Native Americans, we've talked about this before several times, and that is the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act is going to do almost that, and the mineral rushes are going to do quite a bit to bring a population out to this area that Native Americans had kind of laid claim to. Remember, the Homestead Act is created, to get farmers to come out past the 100th meridian. They could claim 160 acres of land, and there was subsequent acts that would allow them to actually claim more. And really all they had to do was improve the land, which meant they needed to farm it. They needed to live on it for 5 years, build the structure, and it was pretty much theirs. And then that homestead could be passed down from generation to generation. There are people still in the Dakotas, in Nebraska, in Wyoming, and even places in Colorado that still have their original homesteads passed down from their family. Some of these got up to be, 300, 500, 1,000 acres. There were ways kind of around the law that you could acquire more land than the 160 acres. A lot of times the land speculators would get a hold of them and sell them first, and then, they would sell them to the farmers. All right. One of the books that's written during this time that all the Native American kind of discrimination is going on was a book called A Century of Dishonor, written by Helen Hunt Jackson. And really, I think all you need to understand is it's really a book that showcases the horrible things that people, the United States government, the series of broken treaties between America and the Native Americans. And it really just highlights how awful we've been to the Native Americans. And that drew a lot of criticism by people towards the government. Unfortunately, even sometimes when we tried to make laws like this one, the Dawes Severalty Act, the Dawes Severalty Act in its conception was created with good intentions in mind. But when we look back on it now, we really look at it as maybe the law that did more damage to hurt Native American culture than kind of anything else that we've ever created. And of course, we don't want to forget that the Removal Act of 1830 was pretty bad as well. But the idea of the Dawes Severalty Act was to kill the Indian and save the man. And what we meant by that is this was the United States government's attempt to civilize the Native American, to get them to live like an American. And we actually thought we were doing a good thing there by putting them into the industrial age where they could have industrial comforts. But what we were really trying to do, without knowing it, is kill their culture. And as we look at that now, that was a pretty big mistake. Now, the Dawes Severalty Act was kind of like the Indian form of the Homestead Act. The idea was that these Native Americans would give up their tribal ways, their communal ways of living, and they would become farmers, and they would live like people for the United States. They were supposed to keep their land for 25 years. That way they couldn't sell it off to some land speculator. And the idea was to give these people homesteads to make them independent. And they were supposed to, the idea was they would become Christian, they would learn to speak English, they would go to American-speaking schools. And the United States would build schools for them. They would, you can see the picture there with, if you look very closely there, you have the white teacher in the middle, and then you've got the Native Americans all around. But really what this does is it creates a reservation system. And for the United States government, this was a lot cheaper to feed the Native Americans and to house them and school them. And that was more cost effective than fighting them in wars. And so that's what we did. Like I said, we tried to frame it and justify it as we're trying to bring these people into, the 20th century or at that time, the late 19th century. But really, all it did was, try to assimilate them and hurt their culture. Okay, you can see here in the 1790s, go through the Removal Act, where you kind of put all the Native Americans west of the Mississippi into that green area in 1860. By 1880, you can see it's starting to disappear by 1890. And then with the Dawes Severalty Act, placing these people on these reservations. If you take a look in 2000, pretty much all those areas that you see in green in 2000, those are all what you would probably call the crappiest areas, the places that you would not want to live. These are the places that we shove Native Americans into these reservation systems. If you ever go to a Native American reservation, it's really, for the most part, most of them are pretty sad. They almost look like you're in an LDC, where these people, they really live pretty poorly. Another way to look at this, the territorial losses from 1850 to 1890. Okay, next group that we're going to talk about is the Great Mineral Rushes. We've already kind of talked about this before, so I won't spend a lot of time with this. But remember, the mining rushes start in the late 1840s or 1850s. The so-called 49ers in California. It's going to work its way to Colorado, and then you're going to see Nevada get in there in the 1860s as well with us. And then in the 1870s, you're going to see gold found in Montana, in Idaho, and in the Dakotas. Now, these boom towns, people would come in by the thousands once they heard that there was a gold strike. And these boom towns would basically just get built out of nothing. And then they were just lively and, just wild and crazy for a couple of years. And then once most of the gold or silver or whatever lead or copper or whatever it was, once it was found, then the place would basically vacate. And you'd have the so-called ghost town. Now, the two kinds of minings that you should know is placer versus lode mining. Placer mining would be the surface mining. So this would be what these people on the right-hand picture are doing. They're just doing it with pans, sometimes with a small little sluice there, like you see. But it's very surface mining. And then after they were done, then the machines of the industrial age would come in, and they could get down a couple of 100 feet and really get the quartz and the gold that was in that quartz, or the silver, as it be may, to go into the deep stuff. So the lode mining was the stuff that they would go in, and they would basically make mines down into the mountain a couple 100 feet. Those were very expensive operations. Typically speaking, the placer happened first and the lode happened second. Okay, one of probably the largest find of any of the mineral rushes was in Gold Hill, Nevada, in what's called the Comstock lode, and over about $300 million worth of gold and silver were found in that Comstock lode. Now, that's not to say there was other places. I'm going to show you guys a map here in just a second of the various mineral rushes, but that one was probably one of the biggest ones. Okay, some of the famous boom towns, Virginia City, Nevada, that was a big silver one. Leadville, Colorado, Black Hills, South Dakota, Deadwood, South Dakota. That'd be another big one. So these boom towns would have been pretty fun to be in. It might be a little crazy too. There wasn't a lot of law enforcement. And so basically you kind of if you felt unsafe, you carried a gun. And there's really, not a lot of police force. So there's vigilante force. These places could be pretty wild and crazy. All right. So again, here's the major ones that you can see there. You can see the ones in Colorado, Silver Plume, Golden, Central City, Blackhawk. Southwest Colorado, there would be Silverton by Durango. And then you can see some of the gold ones up there in Montana, Idaho, and South Dakota, Virginia City out in Nevada. And then the original one, Sutter's Mill in California, outside of San Francisco. Okay, remember that people came in, they wanted to strike gold. It was very optimistic to start. You can see these makeshift tents, places that are built pretty quickly to service the miners, anything that they needed. So, supplies, laundry, even bathhouses where they could clean up. Obviously, saloons, even places like operas, restaurants. So there's pretty cool to see if they were in kind of in high tide. Like I said, very rough. There wasn't a lot of law. Before these places really didn't have an established population. Most of them were men, single men in their 20s to 40s, and there weren't very many women. You're talking anywhere from a ratio of 10 to 1 men to women at the low, or sometimes even 100 men to women, 1 woman at a kind of a high ratio. So, the women that were in these towns were typically laundresses, they were cooks, or they were prostitutes. There wasn't a lot of families in these areas. It's too rough for that kind of thing. Okay, the men were tough and the working conditions were tough. I mean, people that were doing this, they weren't out there for a vacation. They were out there to work, and they were out there for a lot of times in the elements. So it'd be very cold up in the mountains. They were working long hours a day because they wanted to get as much gold as they could and then get the heck out of there and go back home. So they were working a lot of hours, and they're out in the middle of the wilderness, so it's like camping every day. Pretty tough working conditions. Okay, and then the towns busted pretty much as quickly as they boomed. From Colorado, you can see the little Conestoga wagon there, Pikes Peak or bust. And then there are even people that had written on their Conestoga wagon, "By gosh, we busted." So just as quickly as these mining towns popped up, within a couple of years, they were ghost towns like you see in the bottom right-hand corner. Okay, the last group that we're going to talk about today is going to be the settlement by the Cattlemen. So kind of in terms of, order, probably you're talking about the mineral rushes are going to be the first groups that are in. The farmers kind of come in secondly, and then the cattlemen come in third. And then kind of after the cattlemen, we get more farmers in. All right, so really the story of the cowboys comes from Spain, where the cattle are brought in. And so the cattle that were brought in from Spain, pretty hardy stock. They could multiply pretty well. They could live off of grass. They were pretty hardy, and so they could deal with pretty dry climates. And so, by the time that we're talking in the 1860s and 1880s, there are literally, just like there were millions of buffalo up in the Nebraska and Dakotas and Montanas and Wyoming, there were millions of cattle that were ranging around in the area of like Texas and New Mexico and southern Colorado by the end of the Civil War. And they were just basically just sitting there waiting to be taken. And by the 1860s and 70s, we started to have technology available to get these cattle where they needed to go, because the problem was when we didn't have any railroads that went to where the cattle were. So you had to drive the cattle, hundreds of miles to the nearest railroad track. And by the time you did that, a lot of times they were kind of thin. So you had to do the best you could to kind of fatten them up by the time that you got there. And then once you got them to Abilene or Dodge City or Laramie or even Denver, Bozeman or Billings or something like that, you had to load them out all on the train and then get them back to the east to Cincinnati or Chicago or somewhere where they were going to be slaughtered and then sent from there even more back east. Okay, so the railroad was very critical to the cattle industry. Once you get the Transcontinental Railroad, really then the great cattle boom kind of starts. And so you'd have these great drives sending cattle from Texas up into Kansas, up into Colorado, up into Montana. But really, I would say probably Abilene, Kansas, and Dodge City, Kansas, they really become our first great kind of what we would call cattle boom towns. All right, so the cattle drive was pretty exciting in terms of mythical stories, but probably in reality, it wasn't that great. Many of the cowboys were Mexican American. Many of them were actually African American. About 25%. It is estimated about 25% of the cowboys were African Americans that came from the South. And then, of course, a lot of settlers coming in. They were either immigrants or people from back east that would come in. And these cattle were free, basically. You just had to kind of round them up, and then you could take them and sell them and make money. And so, you would have some sort of a wagon where you could keep food for yourself. The cows would just eat off the grass on the way up. You'd find watering holes where they could get water, and then you'd drive them up, and you'd get them to the nearest railroad depot. Now, eventually, so many people started coming in that they started laying claim to the land, by way of the Homestead Act. We also get, besides the cattle drives, we get, sheep herders that come in the area, and you get a series of range wars. And the range wars really, probably for the most part, were in the 1870s, maybe early 1880s. And really, it's a kind of an ongoing confrontation between the different ranchers. So you're talking sometimes between sheep herders and cattle herders, but also then besides the ranchers, you have the other farmers. And so these farmers, in the 1880s, early 1880s, by that time, the invention of barbed wire, as you can see in the bottom left-hand corner, had really started to circulate around. And so, how could you kind of stake your claim? You put up these fences with the barbed wire, and then if your cattle walked into it, it hurt them. And so you had to kind of keep your cattle or your sheep away from wherever this was. Well, to sabotage your competitor or a person trying to claim your land, you just go clip their barbed wire, and this led to shootings and killings, and people would burn houses of one another. I mean, it got really bad in Texas, especially. And so really that kind of, by the end of the 1880s, we really kind of see an end to all the great open range of the cattle and the sheep herders. The sheep herders end up going mostly kind of to the higher elevations where it was cooler for their sheep in the summer. Where there's more water up there coming down from the mountains. And by that time in the 1880s, you have the railroads starting to come in even to the south. And so there's really not really much of a need to drive the cattle anymore. And you ended up getting kind of a sedentary kind of ranch industry. You can see here the major trails from where I was talking about. You have one that the Goodnight Loving Trail. The Goodnight was a guy's name. I know it's kind of a weird name. But that's basically I-25. If you kind of take I-25 up, that was the trail. And same thing with the Western Trail and these other. They're pretty much interstates now. But back then, you would take them up to Abilene or to Ellsworth or to Dodge City or to Ogallala, Cheyenne, Laramie, and these are where the major railroad depots were. All right, very quickly, we're going to go through some of the cowboy culture that comes out of the American West. Probably the most famous artist that does paintings about the mountain scenery would be Albert Bierstadt, and we know that Mount Bierstadt was named after him. He comes from the kind of the Rocky Mountain School, so don't get Rocky Mountain School mixed up with like the Ashcan School, or certainly the Hudson Valley School, Hudson River School. When we talk about the Rocky Mountain School, there's only one name you need to know, and that's Albert Bierstadt, painting scenes about the Rocky Mountains. Now, the myth of the cowboy was that, this was a great, exciting lifestyle, but really it was pretty boring. Most of the time you're just riding a horse, you're rounding up cows. It was very hard work, branding the cattle, castrating the cattle, whatever needed to be done. It was never that much fun. And so really the dime novel stores made it seem like it was a great thing, but really it was pretty hard work and really for the most part on a day-to-day basis, pretty boring. And really for the cowboys themselves, they didn't make a lot of money. Most of the money was made by the people that paid for the operation. Okay, but certainly you had a number of promoters of the West. We talked about the Wild West shows, kind of mythifying the battles between the Native Americans and the cowboys. Horace Greeley was the editor of a big newspaper in New York, and he actually bought a bunch of land in Colorado and advertised it about how great it would be to go to and get the fresh air of the West and open land. Mark Twain wrote a book called Roughing It that talks about the mineral rushes and really kind of the time between the 1870s, 1880s. Frederick Remington is another one of these artists. You can see one of Frederick Remington's paintings down below there, painting of the, kind of the Great West. So really, if you see a picture like this, it's Remington. If you see a picture of the mountains, it's probably Bierstadt. Okay, last slide here, impacts of the cattle industry. Not only the cattle industry, but I would say, you want to probably make sure you read about the mining devastation. You'd want to talk about, farmers coming in, plowing up this prairie grass, and planting wheat, grazing cattle, grazing sheep, grazing pigs. All of this added up to environmental destruction of the West to some degree and changing the ecosystem. Obviously, decimated the buffalo herds. So as Americans came in, they obviously changed the ecosystem of the West, made it even more arid than it was. Another impact of the cattle industry are the great meat trusts, and so we're going to get like the steel trust and the bank trust. And we're also going to get meat trusts. We're going to get a beef trust, a pork trust. So the Swift family, they're going to be. We still see around the Swift meat products around today. So there's going to be meat combinations just like there was business combinations of other kinds. Talked about Gustavus Swift. He's noted for creating one of the really good versions of the refrigerated rail car. Once you have the refrigerated rail car, then you could slaughter the beef, before they got too skinny, keep them pretty fat, slaughter them, and then put them on the refrigerated rail car, get them to the markets in the East. And then they could, people like Swift made a lot more money doing that. As I mentioned before, as more and more railroads got built throughout the Gilded Age, we're going to see transcontinental lines even in the South. And so it's not that the cattle industry died, it's just that they became more sedentary. And really the ranches started settling around where the railroad was, and there was no real need for the cattle drive anymore. And we also want to highlight the important role of women because this is a very rugged lifestyle. Even though women are greatly outnumbered at first, once the cattle industry becomes more sedentary, and so you have more ranches, more farms, you're going to see women play a central role because they not only do the domestic qualities, but they also have to work out on the ranch or out on the farm, and it's going to give them more of a voice when it comes to voting. Okay, so that should be it for today. We'll start with the farmers next time. Thank you for tuning in for this first part of Farmers in the West.